It's graduation day. We're going to move from the beginning student language to the next most advanced language. It isn't a big move, but it's a good move. The way you do it is you go into the lower corner of Dr. Racket here and you switch from beginning student to beginning student with list abbreviations. Now, what are list abbreviations? Well, by this point, you've probably gotten a little annoyed at having to write something like cons A, cons B, cons C, empty, when all you really wanted to do was make a list of 3 items, A, B, and C. And what list abbreviations do is they let you write that more compactly as just list A, B, C. Now, lists created with the list primitive are exactly like lists created with cons. Okay, that's a list of 3 elements. If I run this now, what you'll see is that because I've turned on the list abbreviations language, Racket shows me the value of this expression using list notation, and it also shows me the value of this expression using list notation. So you could still construct lists with cons, and in many cases you'll still want to construct them with cons. But you could also construct them with list. And Racket's always going to show them to you with list. Now, just like cons, list is a primitive for constructing lists, and it's a notation Racket uses for presenting list values. And so, for example, you can say list plus 1, 2 plus 3, 4 plus 5, 6. So this is a call to the list primitive with 3 operands. When you run that, you'll get back list 3, 7, 11 because those operands are reduced to values before the list is created. And so what you see is a list with the values. Now, an important point here, which is that when you construct lists one at a time in a function, you're still going to want to use cons, and let me show you why. Suppose I say define L1 is list B, C, and define L2 is list D, E, F. And I'll run that. Now I've got those 2 definitions. Now watch this. If I say cons A onto L1, that produces the value I probably wanted, which was to take the list L1 and add an A to the front. On the other hand, if I say list A L1, that doesn't produce the value I want. That produces a list in which the first element is A, and the second element is the value of L1, which is some other list. So I get a funny list here that has A as its first element and a list as its second element. I'm not saying you can't have lists with lists in them. Sometimes that's exactly what you want. All I'm saying here is watch out when you're trying to add one element to a list. You use cons. You don't use list. You use list when you're trying to make a fully formed list all at once. So for example, you might want to say list L1, list L2. That would be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And conceivably, even this middle thing would be a reasonable thing to say. But usually when you write something like that, you're going to want to use cons. Let me show you one other list primitive that sometimes is quite useful. It's called append. And it consumes 2 lists, and what it does, let me comment these things out. Append consumes 2 lists, and what it does is it produces a single list by adding the 2 lists together. So it's kind of like string append. It contains all the elements of L1 followed by all the elements of L2. Now, one final thing about list notation rather than cons notation. If you find list notation confusing, you don't have to start using it right away. We're going to use it, so you need to be able to read it. It's still perfectly fine for you to write that list that way instead of that way. They both mean the same, they're both correct. We think most of you will soon find it more convenient to use list notation, but cons notation is still perfectly valid. There's a few exercises that come up now to help test your understanding of list notation, and in particular to test the issue of when to use cons to add something to a list.